Okay, so thank you again for having me here. And in the next 10 minutes or so, I'll try to present some kind of a snapshot of where the Israeli startup and the tech ecosystem in general is at. So moving to the first slide, I think the numbers basically speaks for themselves. What we see here is a very innovative culture of around 1,000 new innovative companies every year. I think it was almost 11,000 companies, new innovative companies over the past decade. Seems like everyone in Israel is an entrepreneur. Interesting fact is that 20% of these entrepreneurs mentioned here are second timers and 5% are third timers. So there's a real DNA of let's try it, let's pivot it and try again if needed, a real innovative culture. We see a growing numbers of investors, out of which around 165 are Israeli VCs. Some have been around for many years, like Pitango and others, and some are newer funds that are doing great and presenting enormous success, like Aleph TLV and more. Corporation, multinational corporation, all have presence in Israel, and just to name a few, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, GE, and many more. In terms of accelerators, we see many of those. Some are coming from those multinational corporates. So we have an accelerator for Coca-Cola, Mercedes-Benz, Walmart, and we also have those accelerators that are coming from the military. So 8200 EISP is one of the very known accelerator that is actually coming from the intelligence unit. Moving to the next slide, gives some kind of a snapshot of where we were when COVID hit. We were completing a decade of growth, extensive growth. A lot of funds were injected into the tech industry. Some because of low interest rate environment and lack of alternatives, but others just because of that search for innovation. And the number speaks for themselves. There was a lot of growth. Moving to the next slide, we can see some of those known logos. And I think something that we've seen over the past decades was that Israel was no longer just a place to start companies, but also to grow companies. And we created a large and growing numbers of unicorns. Tabula as a world leader, other companies that are very significant to their markets and have gone through mega financing rounds of over $100 million. And this was something that we saw. I think 2019 was a record year with 5 companies that raised over $900 million. In terms of M&As, those corporations that I mentioned before look for a lot of companies and a lot of innovation within Israeli tech. And just to mention a few, in the mobility space, we had Movit that was acquired for $1 billion by Intel. Mobileye, which we all know, that was acquired for over $15 billion in 2017. And we see a lot of that innovation also in the security space. And of course, the public markets and the number and the growing number that we'll touch upon later of companies that went through very successful IPOs. And then with a twist, we'll move to COVID and to the next slide. And when COVID hit, we were really after that decade of growth. And the situation created a new, it was new for everyone in the tech space, not just in Israel. So what we've seen was a lot of companies that were concerned because they were expecting a potential drop in demands, a decrease in investment, a decrease in valuations. And I think the first thing we saw following COVID and the shelter-in-place situation that we were experiencing here in the US as well as in Israel and the rest of the world were investors just trying to guard their home, secure their portfolio companies, make sure they can create a runway for 12 and 18 months by cutting expenses. Some of them were easy to cut, like marketing expenses, travel expenses. We saw some cut in jobs, unfortunately, but that was the first mission. But then what we've seen in Israel after 3 or 4 weeks was actually a slowly turnaround. And we saw that the industry was getting back to itself. Now, obviously, when I'm saying we see some stability and growth, it doesn't apply to all companies. And there is a differentiator here that I would like to touch upon from a few aspects. First of all, is the stage of the company. Obviously, early stage companies were facing more challenges. Some of them just did not have teams that were around long enough and experienced enough. Some did not really establish a product or a market when COVID hit, and they were facing real problems. On the other hand, companies that were in their growth stages and already established that market secured enormous financing rounds. And just a few examples on top of my head is BioCatch, for example, a known company in the cyberspace that secured $150 and $45 million in a C round after COVID hit. Pagaya with $100 million. Just this morning, for those who follow, there's an interesting company called Next Insurance out of here in Palo Alto that raised $250 million with a $3 billion valuation. And these are all these days. In terms of the IPOs, also a very interesting company for a time for Israeli companies. A company here out of the Bay Area, JFrog, just did an amazing IPO in the NASDAQ last week, raised $510 million with a $3.9 billion valuation. Lemonade, also a company in the insurance tech space, raised $320 million recently. And there are some other examples. Another differentiator in terms of a company's ability to raise money is their industry. So obviously companies that are supporting our ability to work from home, from our home office or living rooms, were the ones that felt an increase in their demand. Cyber companies, cloud companies, we see healthcare IT companies that are also having a very good time for them. Having said that, obviously, these are more challenging times for companies in the travel tech and hospitality space. Another very interesting aspect to view is who is those that are investing today in Israeli tech. I've been here in the US for 6 years, and what we've seen over this past few months is actually a very interesting trend. Those serial entrepreneurs that in regular times would have gone here to Sand Hill or New York to raise funds went back to their backyard and raised money in Herzliya or in Tel Aviv, trying to avoid any cultural challenges, any cross-border aspects. Some of them were just in Israel physically and could not come here to meet companies, to meet their investors in person. And this is actually a very interesting situation that's not just affecting the investment aspect, but also the growth aspect, because we know that many companies started Israel, but then their markets are here. They need to meet those design partners at stage one and those potential clients, and they can't. Borders are closed, there's no relocation. It's a very challenging times, and I think a recent report that I read showed that only 5% of early stage companies have any presence in the US compared to 52% of later companies. So this is a real challenge for them, and I think if we can move to the next slide. This is where we come into the picture, and we try to help those companies. So for us in Leumi-Tech USA, the main goal and passion was always around trying to create that bridge between Israeli startups and the US. Just be there beyond that plain vanilla banking, build that network and help the companies connect to the local ecosystem, whether it's VCs, angels, corporates and thought leaders. And this is what we're doing these days, trying to help those companies by hopping on many calls with them, trying to connect them to the local ecosystem. And not just that, there are some governmental programs that are very important for those earlier companies. One program that we were very active with was the PPP program led by the SBA. And this was a governmental program that many of our Israeli-related startups got funding from, and we managed to secure those funds for them in a race really against the clock, but very successful so. And another way is obviously the lending. For those companies that are relevant for that, we are trying to add another layer of funding by a debt on top of their equity rounds. And if we move to the next slide, these days I can't finish such a presentation without hopes for a better future. So I hope you were all touched like I was in light of the recent collaboration between Israel and the UAE. And I'm proud to be a part of the Leumi group, which sent a delegation just last week to the UAE. Which was led by our chairman. Our chairman is Samer Khadijia, which is he's a Muslim and an Arab and an Israeli, and he's the chairman of the Leumi Group. Our CEO of Bank Leumi USA was also a part of that delegation. And beyond the big hopes for peace and a better future for our kids, there are a lot of potential here for collaboration around financial technologies, around agrotech, around digital health, cybersecurity, food tech, renewable energy, and much more. So I'd like to end with this positive note and really maintain that very positive atmosphere for a better future. Yes, it's not going to be easy, especially for early stage startups, but history has shown that companies that were founded throughout crisis times have proven to be more capital efficient and sometimes even more resilient and more initiative than companies that started in times of prosperity. So I'll end with this very positive note and wish everyone Shana Tova and Gmar Chatima Tova, and hope you understood my accent. Thank you again